Adrian N. Breitfelder, City Clerk, you are hereby directed to call a special session of the City Council to be held on Monday, February 17th, 2025 at 5:30 p.m. in the historic Federal Building for the purpose of conducting a work session on sustainable Dubuque.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to a special session of the Dubuque City Council for February 17th, 2025. As a reminder to viewers and listeners, due to the nature of tonight's meeting topic, public input is not accepted. However, you may contact the City Council directly from the city's webpage at www.cityofdubuque.org/council contacts. Attendance for the session is as follows. Mayor Kavanaugh.
Here.
Council members Farber.
Here.
Jones.
Here.
Resnick.
Here.
Roussel.
Here.
Sprank.
Here.
Thank you. Wethel.
Here.
And I will skip the city manager and city attorney. I know they're here, but they are not with us at the moment. Our work session topic is Sustainable Dubuque. I will turn it over to Sustainability Director Gina Bell.
Good evening, Mayor, City Council, Gina Bell, Sustainability. I'm here with Michelle Kim, our colleague, who is the Climate Action Coordinator, and Rachel Meyer from Lotus Sustainability. And tonight, we're going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, greenhouse gas inventories and emissions. We want to talk specifically about our target, which is for 2030, and potentially a longer-term target. So in 2022, Dubuque hired Lotus Engineering and Sustainability to conduct our greenhouse gas inventory, which is community-wide. And we've been measuring since our benchmark year of 2003. Our current target, which was set by City Council, was in 2011, and it's a 50% reduction of our 2003 levels by 2030. Leadership at that time and since has recognized local government's critical role in protecting the environment for our residents and our community. We propose setting a target beyond 2030, which is in 5 short years. And when it was set in 2011, it seemed like far off, but now it's quite close. In the past 5 years in Iowa alone, we've seen 27 individual events that cost $1 billion or more to recover from that were climate and weather related. The city has experienced torrential rains, drought, flooding, storms, heat waves, tornadoes, and winter events. Oh my gosh, excuse me.
Everybody check your phone. Check mine too.
I thought I turned off all my parental lights. Luciana's at Ninja now. Okay, so I recognize that the timing of this is a little bit tumultuous, and politically it would be easier to ignore this. But I want to remind all of you that this is not a political issue. This is a human-centered issue. This deeply impacts our residents, and it's woven throughout what we already do in projects and policies and programming, and it also plays a critical role in our future work. So we can be proactive or we can be reactive. But it's important to know that the impacts will be more costly and detrimental to residents if we're reactionary instead of proactive. One action that we can take is to set a longer target that's pushed further out, like to 2050. Rachel Meyer from Lotus Engineering and Sustainability is going to lead most of the discussion tonight, and she's going to give an in-depth look at how our current inventory works and what a longer-term science-based target might look like. And we want all of you to understand this really at a high level so that if you choose to make a future target, you are well educated and informed. Thank you. Rachel?
Awesome. Thank you, Gina. Good evening, Mayor, and good evening, Council. Thank you so much for having me tonight. So as Gina mentioned, I am Rachel Meyer. I'm a Senior Associate at Lotus Engineering and Sustainability, and I'm our team lead on public sector greenhouse gas emissions inventories. So I'm here tonight to talk about the 2022 greenhouse gas emissions inventory, the business as usual projections that we did, as well as science-based targets and some actions that Dubuque can consider taking out to 2030 and past 2030. So when we get started tonight, I want to make sure we're all on the same, we have the same understanding of greenhouse gases and climate change. So greenhouse gases have always occurred in Earth's atmosphere. There's always been a concentration of them. They act to trap heat towards Earth's surface. That way it's livable for humans. More greenhouse gases have been emitted, however, since the Industrial Revolution, since humans started burning fossil fuels. More greenhouse gases in the atmosphere means we're trapping more and more heat to the Earth's surface, meaning we're like throwing blankets on top of the Earth, making it warmer. The warming of the Earth can lead to, as Gina mentioned, increased temperatures, extreme precipitation, flash flooding, other really detrimental impacts that Iowa has seen recently, and across the country we've seen as recently as the hurricanes in Asheville and the fires out in Los Angeles, worse air pollution included. Lots of really detrimental impacts are beginning to occur. The one way that we know to prevent the worst outcomes from climate change are to start decreasing our greenhouse gas emissions and to stop or reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we're burning to reduce those emissions and prevent those catastrophic outcomes. So, the way that we measure a community's amount of emissions that they're emitting in a given time period is called a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. The way that we calculate these emissions is through the Global Protocol for Community-Wide Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventories. It's our protocol, is what we call it. That protocol gives us the methods, it gives us the acceptable data sources, it gives us the acceptable emission factors and calculations for putting together these totals and the emissions for your community. So, for Dubuque, what we do is we assess which sources of human-caused emissions might be occurring within the city, and then we can organize it in a way like you see on the screen, which is scopes. So scopes tell us what's happening within the boundary versus what might have happened in the boundary, but the actual emissions are occurring outside of the boundary. So for scope 1, that is anything that occurs within the boundary and the emissions are fully being generated and emitted in the boundary. So these being stationary fuel combustion, being natural gas and propane and other sources of heating fuels in buildings, transportation, so on-road vehicles, it's railroads, it's the ports, so waterborne, any transportation, transit also happening within the boundary. And then we also have a landfill and wastewater treatment plant within the boundary, so all of those emissions are also included in scope 1. And then this last source, we have industrial processes and product use, so that is from refrigerant use in HVAC systems, so our air conditioners. So we know all of that, the emissions are occurring and emitted in the boundary, and that's scope 1. Scope 2 is going to be grid-supplied electricity, so that's going to be for houses and buildings as well as vehicles. And then scope 3, as I mentioned, is anything that is generated within the boundary, but the emissions happen outside. So usually where this happens is with the landfill or with the wastewater treatment plant. Oftentimes, we create waste or we create wastewater, but maybe the plant or the landfill is in the next town over. But the emissions are generated from the residents within a community, so that ends up being scope 3. Dubuque, you guys have them both in the boundary, so that actually gets to be scope 1. But the one scope 3 source we have is called transmission and distribution losses. This is on the electric grid, so we know from Alliant Energy how much electricity they produced at all of their power plants and what they sold to the community. And whatever the difference is the loss rate of electricity on the grid. So we can say if the loss rate is 4%, there's an extra 4% of whatever electricity was consumed in your community that didn't make it there. And so we're going to account for those emissions as well. So you can see on the screen, anything with an X is what we did not include, and then everything that is on the screen is included. And I will mention the out-of-boundary transportation is the little bit of emissions from the airport. All right, so in 2022, we were able to assess several sources that you can see on the screen that were not assessed in previous years. As Gina mentioned, you have been conducting inventories all the way back to 2003 with the help of students at the University of Northern Iowa. And the sources that have been included from 2003 to 2018 are on the left side of the screen. So residential home electricity use, natural gas use, commercial and industrial building electricity and gas use, gasoline and diesel used in on-road vehicles, and then the landfill gas from the landfill. In addition to those sources, in 2022, you can see on the screen, we added several smaller sources that occur in the community: propane, diesel and backup generators, the transmission distribution losses. Fugitive emissions are similar to transmission and distribution losses, but that's for the natural gas system rather than the electric grid. And then we split out several transportation sources. So the transit emissions are split out separately. We included railroads and aviation, and then fuel use at the port, so the waterborne activity, composted waste on top of landfill waste, the wastewater treatment plant, and then refrigerant leakage from HVAC systems. And the methodology comparisons, we did our best to use the exact same methods that have been used all the way back to 2003, with the exception of these on the screen. So as a part of calculating emissions, we need to use what's called a global warming potential to get our unit into one comparable unit. So methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide, as well as the refrigerants, all have different impacts on global warming compared to one unit of carbon dioxide. In order to get everything in a common unit, we have to use what's called a global warming potential. And those come from the IPCC's assessment reports. And in 2021, the 6th assessment report came out, which is the most recent science behind global warming potentials. So we used the most recent available global warming potentials to assess emissions. We also were able to collect data straight from Alliant Energy and Interstate Power and Light for electricity data. For on-road transportation, there's a new data source from Google called Environmental Insights Explorer. What they do is they use Bluetooth in your cell phone and in the GPS system in your car to be able to track your trips, so they can get a more accurate model and estimate of the mileage happening fully within the city's boundary. So we use that data. And then we collected data straight from the landfill's reporting to the EPA, because the landfill reports to the EPA on their emissions every year. So we took that data this time. All right, so our comparison between 2018 and 2022. On the left side of the screen, you see 2018's emissions, so just about 820,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's our unit that we measure emissions in. The primary sector of emissions in 2018, the commercial and industrial building energy use sector at 47%, followed by residential buildings at 25%, transportation at 20%, and waste at 8%. And then in 2022, we actually saw a 9% decrease in total emissions between 2018 and 2022. So we're down to 744,112 metric tons. And if we look at our sectors, so we did add that industrial process and product use sector, that being the refrigerant use in HVAC systems. Even with those additional sources, we saw that 9% decrease, and our makeup of the sectors is shifting just a little bit. So commercial and industrial building energy use still our top sector at 43%. Then transportation, with that updated vehicle miles traveled data, is the second largest sector at 30%. Residential building energy use then at 23%. And then the refrigerants and the waste and wastewater both at about 2%. And the graphic on your screen is breaking down the emissions by source now. So you can see that the largest source of emissions is natural gas use in homes and buildings at 32%, followed by electricity at 31%, and then on-road gasoline and diesel use at 29%. So all three of those together are that's about 93% of Dubuque's total emissions coming from building energy use and vehicles on the road. So those are our three biggest sources. Solid waste is only about 2% of emissions, and we'll get into that a little bit later. The rest of those little sources, most of which we added this time actually, are just about 5% of emissions totals. And I want to point out that electricity wedge that's right there at the bottom, bright yellow, we expect that to go away by 2050. Alliant Energy has goals to reach 100% renewable electricity by 2050, which they are steadily working towards, and we've seen that impact in the emissions inventory over time. And should they meet that goal, that electricity wedge will go away. And then we're gonna see those other wedges start to fill in that part of the pie. So knowing that, looking to 2030, looking to 2050, those other remaining wedges are what we might want to focus on to reduce our emissions. Now, another thing we can do is something called benchmarking. So comparing Dubuque's totals and Dubuque's estimates per person and per household to other local communities that are similar in makeup to Dubuque. So you can see on the screen, we've got Iowa City, we've got La Crosse, we've got Rochester, Minnesota, Des Moines, and then Winona, Minnesota, as sort of our comparable neighboring communities that have done emissions inventories to compare to. You'll notice that the inventory years sort of vary, so no one else has done a 2022 inventory yet to be able to compare to, but we do our best to find the most apples to apples that we can to compare. So just take that with a grain of salt. It's not perfect, but we do our best. So you can see what inventory year it was, the total emissions from each of those cities, the population, total households. And then on the far right is what we call our benchmarking, so emissions per person or per capita, and then emissions per household. Dubuque is on the higher end of both emissions per capita and emissions per household. And I believe what's driving that, from my experience with greenhouse gas inventories, there's a lot of, because of the landfill and the wastewater treatment plant and other infrastructure in the community, like the port and the railroads, infrastructure can often lead to higher emissions totals in the community, whereas maybe in Iowa City or La Crosse doesn't have a landfill in the boundary or doesn't have a port, and those emissions just wouldn't occur in the community. But we know infrastructure is really important. You guys are on the Mississippi, you want to have the port. You know, it's nice to have control over the landfill and the wastewater treatment plant, and railways are really efficient for transporting goods and services and people, so I don't want to shame infrastructure. Infrastructure is really good and really important, but just know that that might be playing into some of those higher emissions per capita and emissions per household totals. Another thing to note, all of these cities have climate goals, and most of them go out to 2050. The one instance that does not have a climate goal is Winona, but they are creating their first climate action plan as we speak, so they will likely have goals within the near future. But the majority of these communities on the screen have what we call net zero by 2050 goals. So they want net zero carbon dioxide emissions compared to their baseline by 2050. So that is what they're all working towards. And I want to note that Dubuque has their 2030 goal, and you also have the goal of being the first net neutral community in Iowa. So it's important to keep up this work and meet that goal and beat Iowa City or Des Moines or any of your neighbors. Okay, so taking a look at emissions over time. So what I'm calling the comparable sources are those ones that have been done from 2003 to 2018 against what was assessed in 2022. So the darker blue bar is going to be emissions in 2018, and then the teal colored bar to the right of that is going to be emissions in 2022. What you can see is that most all sources actually decreased between 2018 and 2022 for a variety of reasons. Electricity, that is going to be primarily driven by the emissions factor from Alliant Energy. That decreased quite a bit between 2018 and 2022. On the natural gas side, that could just be a number of factors. It could be efficiency work to weatherize homes. It could be that maybe it was warmer winter, unlike today, and we didn't need as much natural gas to heat buildings. There could be electrification happening, so switching out heating sources from natural gas to electricity in buildings. We were not quite able to pinpoint exactly what's happening, but some combination of all of that is likely playing into the change over time. On-road, however, is the one source that did increase, so vehicle traffic is increasing within the community. That could also partially be because of the updated data source and the more kind of localized, accurate look at vehicle miles traveled in your community. And then the landfill you're gonna see actually has a really significant decrease between 2018 and 2022. And that's because the landfill started capturing gas from the decomposition of waste. And that brings our emissions down a lot by doing that. And that's awesome. That was a really, maybe not easy win, it's kind of an expensive win, but it's a win in of itself and we need to celebrate that. That does not mean though that the work is over. If you continue to have the same amount of tonnage deposited every year or see an increase in the tonnage deposited at the landfill, that bar is gonna go back up because then there's more waste to decompose over time. So that really emphasizes the need to divert more waste to compost or recycling over time to prevent the landfill waste emissions from going up. And then this is looking back towards 2003 for the first greenhouse gas emissions inventory for the community. You see that baseline on the far left. So emissions in 2003 were 1.1-ish million metric tons. And then on the far right is going to be the 2022 emissions total that we saw, 744-ish thousand metric tons. The bars in between, so the teal ones are showing a decrease between inventory years, and then the orange bars are showing increases in between inventory years. I'll note that there is not an inventory for every single year. From 2003 to 2022, you'll notice the gaps between them on the x-axis below. But there's many, many, many inventories that we can try to see trends between. And overall, between 2003 and 2022, there is a 34% decrease in emissions, which is awesome. All right, so something called a science-based target is becoming more and more frequently used by communities across the US, but also across the world. So back in 2019, I think, is when the Paris Accord agreement happened, that the global community agreed to holding global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. We don't want to go above that. That's when those catastrophic impacts start to happen. So the US did commit to that. They're no longer a part of that, but there was commitment to that. And communities across the US are calculating what they're calling a science-based target. So that is helping to cap the amount of emissions in a given community to prevent more than 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global warming. What it does is it takes several data points that you can see on your screen, the Human Development Index score, population projections, and then a baseline year of emissions, just scope 1 and 2, so none of the transmission distribution losses, not the airport, and is able to do some math on the back end and estimate a 2030 emissions target as well as a 2050 target. The 2050 target for everyone is net zero across the board. Everyone is net zero. For 2030, that looks different by community. It's usually anywhere between 60 and 64% of emissions reduction from your baseline year, just based on the intricacies of the data points. So when we looked at Dubuque's Human Development Index score, population, the baseline year emissions for scope 1 and 2, what that looks like in 2030 is a 62.4% decrease from 2018 totals. I'm going to go into that a little deeper into these next slides. So what that looks like then, in 2018, our scope 1 and 2 emissions, you see 819,408. That is the actual emissions total. Then in 2022, what the actual scope 1 and 2 emissions are is 734,531 metric tons. So those are real numbers. That's why they're italicized. The 62.4% decrease from 2018 looks like about 308,000 metric tons of emissions by 2030. So you can see about how much there is to decrease, about 425,000-ish by 2030. From that 2022 number, we don't know obviously what maybe 23 or 24 looked like, but from that 2022 number, pretty significant decrease over time. And then we were able to estimate it stepwise out to 2050 because that's a pretty big gap between 2030 and 2050. So looking at that stepwise, you can see it's about 72% in 2035, 81% in 2040, 91% in 2045, and then we're at 0 in 2050. Another thing we did was taking a look at that based on the sectors that we saw at the beginning. So stationary energy is that building energy use, transportation, waste and wastewater, and then refrigerants. So looking at 2022, the italicized totals are the decrease from 2018 that has already happened, or for transportation, the increase that has happened. So looking at that again stepwise from 2030, 35, and on, you can see all of those need to see significant decreases in order to meet that overall 308,000 or 62.4% target. It looks different for different sectors based on the proportion of the sector's impact on total emissions. So since stationary energy was the largest sector, that has a large amount of emissions. You'll see waste actually doesn't have that much further to go because it's already seen a 72% decrease, but that's why we can't stop the action. We need to keep working to divert waste and prevent methane and waste emissions from occurring. But we do have it stepwise, so that way you see action needs to continue happening all the way through 2050. The last thing that we put together for you guys was a business as usual model. We updated the one that was done for the Climate Action Plan update using 2022 data and several other pieces to help us project emissions forward. So we took a look at population increase. There's a projected doubling of railway emissions, so that was incorporated in there. The electricity emission factor goal from Alliant Energy is in there. You can see that orange wedge at the bottom is electricity emissions, so that's what we're thinking it's gonna look like if they meet that target in 2050. What else? The other thing that we incorporated was the adoption of electric vehicles within the community. So we have background data that tells us what the adoption rate increases back in 2023 looked like. So we incorporated that into this model to show that shift of electric vehicle uptake and then the reduction associated with the decrease in fossil fuel emissions. Everything else was pretty much projected on population, especially household energy use and other transportation factors. So with all of that together, looking at that, you can see that in 2030, we have a 12% decrease, just doing nothing, letting stuff happen as is by 2030. And then in 2050, we have a 38% decrease. Most of that coming from that electricity emission factor becoming 0 that you can see over time. So just to reiterate some of what we're seeing, the increases come from natural gas in buildings, increases in commercial square footage, increases in population, lead to more buildings. And if we're not making those electric, that's gonna increase our natural gas emissions. As I mentioned, the railway activity, increases in waste and wastewater, that's directly tied to population, and then refrigerants also with building growth. Then the decrease you see from electricity, Alliant electricity emission factor, the transmission distribution losses that are associated with that, and then you see the shifting between electric vehicle adoption, which reduces fossil fuel vehicle emissions over time. All right, so I've just thrown a lot of data at you and a lot of numbers. Want to reiterate, what can Dubuque do? You guys have a 2030 target. I also want to mention that science-based target, just an option. It's not, I'm not saying to adopt it, it's just an option that's out there. You already have a 2030 target. But it's important to remember that there's still work to be done. So what can Dubuque do to meet that 2030 target? Really critical, especially in these days when federal funding is a little bit in limbo, continuing to inform and educate residents and doing community outreach. The government can only do so much to help reduce emissions and do this work. It's really, we need the community to take part and take their own action. So doing outreach and education and informing the public is going to be really, really critical to helping reach those goals. Also, as a community, not just as a local government, helping to inform about reducing natural gas and fossil fuel emissions. So basically, we want to electrify. We know and we hope that electric emission factor becomes 0 by 2050. That is the utilities doing. It's great. You don't have to do anything. However, we still have those natural gas and fossil fuel emissions left over, and that's going to require swapping out equipment and vehicles to electric models. Also doing energy efficiency work, because it's good to not have to use more energy than we need to if we don't have to. And also electric vehicle strategies. Another really important action is leading by example. So Dubuque as a municipality can show what other residents could be doing by leading by example. So that could be electrifying buildings, fleet vehicles, transit vehicles, working on waste diversion and really promoting recycling and composting at city facilities, you know, taking part in that and also helping to educate the departments on their role in that. Using city funds to incentivize the adoption of stricter building codes. Building codes can help increase efficiency in buildings if we push stricter codes. So that is something that could happen. And then finally, continuing to do the Sustainable Dubuque Community Grants Program and the Youth Climate Action Grants. Those have been really, really successful, and so we want to make sure to keep doing those. Some ideas from other municipalities. Obviously, no municipality is the same. Some things work in other communities that don't work here or in other places, but from our work across the country, what we've been seeing that has been successful in other communities, rebates for electric bikes and vehicles, especially in larger, not even just larger cities, but other places across the country, electric bikes seems to be really, really popular, especially in Colorado. I'm based in Denver. I've seen a lot of smaller mountain communities have really high success in offering electric vehicle rebates or electric bike rebates or bike share programs. Really getting people out of their cars and onto bikes and bike paths has been really successful. E-bike sharing programs, as I mentioned. Single hauler waste ordinances, so these can be for residential buildings, commercial buildings, all of the above. Also putting in that ordinance to require recycling and require composting. The single hauler waste ordinance is really important for transportation emissions on top of requiring the recycling and the composting collection. Fewer haulers in your community or fewer trash trucks driving through your neighborhood, which is always kind of nice. Expanding compost hauling services that will help to ensure that the diversion rate at the landfill stays high and those waste emissions don't creep up over time. Sustainable building codes, those can help with energy efficiency and also with putting renewable energy on the building, electric vehicle, charging station options, those sorts of things. Educating about co-benefits of natural areas. So this is something that has started more recently, and it's the importance of parks, other natural areas, having trees around the city. Trees have really amazing just life benefits and air quality benefits and public health benefits on top of just reducing emissions and sucking down carbon from the atmosphere. It also helps to, reduce your home's energy bill if you've got the shade. It helps the local air quality. It helps just quality of life for people. Having trees around is shown to be really, really helpful for public health and well-being. And then incentives for energy efficiency and electrification. We like to help reduce those energy bills, more electric equipment is going to mean less emissions, all of those sorts of things. And then finally, looking forward, so there are long-term financial benefits to doing climate action work. So the social cost of carbon is a metric that we use to estimate, based on your emissions inventory, what the impact of not doing anything would be. It's the cost of emitting a ton of carbon dioxide. That value, the more emissions you have, the more it could cost to be reactive, as Gina mentioned. So by reducing the amount of carbon that we're emitting, we're reducing the potential cost of those negative impacts that might happen. Also reduce, ideally, the potential for natural disasters into the future, improving the resilience of your community. Utility and maintenance cost savings. So studies have shown that electric vehicles have lower maintenance costs over time. Doing energy efficiency work, really important for reducing utility bills for homes and businesses. So working on doing those, that's a benefit directly to your community. And then building resilience for disproportionately impacted communities. So oftentimes in climate work, it's those who can afford to do the work that do it first. And we want to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind in this process. And we want to make sure that the resilience is built for the whole community, not just parts of the community. So by bringing those communities along with us and really centering them in climate action work is going to be widely beneficial for the resilience of your whole community. And as Gina mentioned, 2030 is coming up really fast. It's really pretty soon at this point. So the work can't stop in 2030. I don't think we're going to magically solve climate change and eliminate emissions by 2030. So we can't stop there. We know we need to keep working and keep going past 2030. So as you saw, science-based targets go to 2050. And we need to think past that and work on investing in some of the more expensive solutions. So climate-friendly infrastructure, public transit, shared bike lanes, other bigger projects that might be a little bit more expensive to implement. Focus on taking bite-sized pieces first to build up to the bigger actions. It's hard to just jump right into the really expensive electrify all the buildings in the community. That's a lot. That's hard to do. So if we can start to build interim actions and interim steps into our work, that might help us to build up to those bigger actions and those bigger targets. Continue outreach and education. It's really critical to have the public's buy-in and the public to be able to help us meet these goals over time, and that's done through outreach and education. And then, as I mentioned, federal funding is a little bit in limbo right now. So this work is not free. It costs money. We know that money has to come from somewhere. So in order to keep working on this and taking those bite-sized pieces and really integrating this into all of the work that's done at the city and throughout the community, there needs to be some form of a funding source to keep this work going, because without it, nothing's going to get done. And we need to keep going past 2030 and keep working on reducing those emissions so we don't see those catastrophic impacts going forward. I believe that's it.
All right. Well, Rachel, thank you very much. I found an amazing picture of the bridge there to close with. I don't even know where that came from, but that's a good one. All right. Questions and discussion. We have plenty of time here before our 6:30 meeting. Mr. Resnick.
Yes, I had several, but I'll just ask a couple because others will want to talk. So a few things. First of all, I think this is important work, so thank you for helping us in this situation. It's always harder to get the voluntary involvement versus mandatory involvement that we're talking about here. We're doing pretty well, and I hope that once we get to the 2030, when we fulfill that pledge, I hope we can celebrate it, even if we're looking beyond that to the next thing, because that was not small. And so the sector-based targets, first of all, if one sector is doing better, it's going to help our overall picture, right? We have some very tough bits there, especially the buildings So yes, the science-based goals, you have a lot of realistic projections that I think you put up there. Is there a realistic projection for the estimated costs of fulfilling that science-based goal here in Dubuque, Iowa?
Ooh, that is a really good question. And I think that depends on what actions you would take to hit those goals. If you're looking at, for instance, building electrification, that can get really pricey, depending also on, the age of the building and the systems within it. But that can be many, many millions of dollars to do that. Cheaper work would be to do the education and outreach, would be to work on electric vehicles or swap out the transit buses, for instance, for electric buses. That could be definitely a more affordable action. Regardless, it is going to be expensive. I don't have an exact figure. We haven't done that math yet, but.
That would be helpful. Okay. So from what I'm reading, electric cars and public transit are still a tough sell.
Okay.
And do you see any possibilities of hydrogen cars or other types of transportation or the over the road? Do you see anything coming that might be more helpful and more possible? I mean, we have electrical cars right now. Again, the numbers are not great as far as selling them. So do you see anything coming on the horizon?
That is a great question. I know, electric vehicles vary by state and by city, whether the adoption rate is high or not. Hydrogen, I haven't seen a lot of vehicles on the market yet on that. I know there's a lot of research being done at the national labs regarding hydrogen vehicles, so that might be something in the near future that could pop up. I think the one thing that I have seen other communities do is for transit buses specifically, there are CNG and LNG buses available now that can take the gas that's collected at a landfill or collected at the wastewater treatment plant and turn it into fuel that can be used in the buses and combusted that way. And that's a much better solution than flaring it or just letting that methane emit into the atmosphere. That way it's converted from methane to CO2, basically. So that is something that other communities I've seen use, and that's a nice circular solution. But other than that, I would say I think the electric bikes are a little bit more palatable than electric vehicles. I've seen hybrids do better in other communities. Hybrids are still really good, more efficient in some ways than gas vehicles. So a lot of other solutions out there, but I haven't seen a lot on hydrogen yet.
Well, thank you for your answers. That's enough for me right now. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Roussel.
Thank you. I noticed you said there were some new categories in the most recent study, and one of them was relatively small but kind of intriguing, and that was refrigerants. I wondered how we measure that and where do you get the data for that kind of a number?
Yes, that is a great question. So that is from our protocol. So as I mentioned, the protocol that tells us the methods and how we calculate those emissions. They have, for any source, transportation, building energy use, they have what's called a default calculation based on location and the size of your community. So they have default estimates for us for the refrigerant leakage in homes and businesses. So what we do is we take the quantity of square footage for both residential homes and then commercial buildings. We assume a proportion of it is air conditioned. We know not everyone has air conditioned, so we worked with Gina to come up with an accurate estimate of how the proportion of homes and businesses that would have refrigerants or air conditioning systems in them. And then there's a standard in the protocol that says it's 3 to 5% leakage on a system. So we took that 3% on the lower end and said of a system's refrigerant use based on the size of a home or the square footage of a business, that 3% would be what was leaked. And then we assign those global warming potentials to that amount of leakage and calculate emissions that way. So we don't have specific data from HVAC companies or anything of maybe recharging air conditioners or systems, but we were able to use the default methods from the protocol.
So how would we improve something like that if we're just getting default information?
Good question. I think the one way to improve that, knowing that our world is warming and we're using more air conditioning, we could work with those HVAC companies to collect data and try to collect actual recharge data from those companies and go about it that way rather than estimating. Otherwise, it would be working with those companies to understand the specific refrigerants that they're using when they recharge these systems. There's other refrigerants that are older and older that are now outlawed that you can't use in air conditioners anymore. So knowing that if we're swapping those in older systems, that's going to make an emissions impact because the newer refrigerants have a lower impact on global warming. So working to understand those trends, I think, is probably the one way.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Ms. Wethel.
As it relates specifically to the point you made about how those with financial means find it easier to make changes in their life that are costly related to our emissions personally and as a household, I'm just curious about, you had recommended supporting those households as a cost-effective way with education. Now, we send out our bill to our residents here in Dubuque, and sometimes we put a lot of educational information in that, and so I'm just wondering if you have any feedback for us on specific programs that, or educational pieces that would be beyond what we already do. I feel like we do quite a bit of education in those mailings, but if you could somehow dial it in for someone related to their own household. So for instance, maybe do more of a graphic on month to month, or we noticed this last month, here's an idea. Some kind of an algorithm that would push out something. I don't know, I'm just curious about what ideas you have. And in my eyes, that's a really easy way we have to access residents with educational pieces.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, is how to get those people engaged. Something we've seen from the work that we've done is there's always utility programs for those lower income residents and weatherization programs that maybe they'll pay for a certain chunk of the cost of doing an audit of an apartment or someone's home and pointing out to them, maybe you need some more insulation on this pipe, or you need to, get a different door because there's an inch gap at the bottom and you see the air coming through. So there's ways that I think working with the utility might be a helpful way to get to those people that maybe you could just push information at, but they won't listen. So maybe through the utility. Otherwise, we've seen through trusted community organizations. So if there's any, local nonprofit or local, like a church group or whatever method those lower income folks have to get with their communities and engage with other people in their communities. Because sometimes we've seen that folks just don't resonate with the city, but if there's a trusted organization that they go to, then they'll take the info and take it home and try to implement it. So maybe working with some of those local organizations to get the information.
Thank you.
Ms. Farber.
Yes, I do. Thank you. Great presentation. And I have a couple of questions regarding the commercial, industrial, and the residential buildings and the build-outs. And I noticed in a lot of the larger installations that are occurring right now that geothermal and solar are being used to help reduce emissions, and even homes are doing that as well. Your thoughts about that, because it wasn't mentioned, I didn't think in your presentation, is to even 0.11% or something. Is there a measurement or an inventory about those kinds of uses or those kinds of offsets, if you will, for the emissions?
That's a great question. We should have information, I don't think it's in the presentation, but there should be information on the solar programs through Alliant Energy, so we can show you kind of what emissions did not happen because there were solar installations on homes or businesses. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but it should be in there. For geothermal, I'm not sure I've seen data on that. It is becoming more frequent. It is far more expensive usually than solar, but it is a really reliable way to have renewable energy at your home or business. There are, in some states, I think, grants to do that, not everywhere. I know it varies by state and municipality, the amount of solar you can have in your community, but those are both fantastic options if they're available.
Right, and Dubuque has a lot of water wells. We have a lot of water basins. So a lot of the installations, at least I know in some of the University of Dubuque, for example, whenever there's a new building, we go for the geothermal base. And that helps with your heat as well as your air conditioning. So I'd be curious to see if that ever could be added to the inventory list.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Jones, do you have anything? No? You don't have to, but,
Yeah,
okay, go for it.
I think you bring us a good question to Mo if our 2030 goal is realistic anymore. So I think it's going to get harder the next 4 years at the federal level. It's already getting harder at the state level to have the cash that we need flow to the city to do programs. I also think we're early in our sustainability efforts. We were gifted with a couple of monumental changes in the community that had nothing to do with us. Wisconsin Power Light shutting down the coal plant in Cassville reduced the level of airborne contaminants that Dubuquers were breathing. And Alliance Dubuque plant switched to natural gas in 2011, then to shut it down in 2017, dramatically dumped the amount of natural gas in the environment here. There's some hope on the horizon. Alliant is doing big things. They've got an enormous solar installation they're attaching to the grid at the former site of the Duane Arnold nuclear plant in Cedar Rapids. That's going to power about 40,000 homes pretty easily. There's an interesting initiative just last September. BMW and Toyota, two of the largest manufacturers of automobiles in the world, have decided to partner on developing a viable hydrogen fuel cell car. They've already got the engine technology. They're building a drivetrain that they're going to open license to anybody that wants to build it, which is kind of neat. So there's some things happening out there that are going to move the needle. We're kind of catching up with the landfill as we develop additional landfill space. We're dropping more wells and adding to that capacity, and it is being converted into landfill natural gas. It goes in the natural gas pipeline here and heats homes and businesses. So little of that is getting wasted. Some still gets flared when we have issues with a clogged pipe or something, but for the most part, that's happening. So we're running out of easy things to do is the thing, and easy things that other people are doing for us. And I think we need to pump the brakes on 2030 a little bit, or we're going to be disappointed, because that's only 5 years away, and we've got a long way to go. It's still incredibly important work, but I think you've given us a wake-up call that we need to look at the science and look at what's doable, and go from there, drive our decision-making from that point, because it's going to be real hard to be aggressive at this, I think, for the next several years.
Thanks, Mr. Jones. Mr. Sprank, did you have anything? Don't want to forget about you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Actually, they're pretty in-depth questions, and I know we don't have as much time, so I will send them in an email. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sprank. Well, Rachel, thank you very much for this time. I think you definitely gave us a lot to work with here. I know my head is swimming with a lot of information that you have shared, and something that I think we'll be looking at more carefully. Some interesting points made around the table here about kind of where we sit, and it strikes me that this work in particular is the kind of work that comes with major swings on the national and international level. Sometimes those are major emotional swings for the people that are really invested in the work, but it's also just realistically and pragmatically major swings. Either, we went from a couple of years ago having, upwards of $1 trillion flowing towards this work, and then in about a 3 to 4 week period, about $1 trillion being wiped away from this work. And I think, you started by saying that this isn't a political issue necessarily. You were just going to talk about the factual issues. And I think that's a really good place to stick with this. Because no matter how you feel about the politics of the swings are just there. It's just the reality. So when the work that we do here is work based in reality, We don't get to just pretend that real things don't exist. We actually have to deal with potholes, and we have to deal with covers of sewers that fly off when it rains too much. We have to deal with these things. So I think what I'm really walking away with from this is, along with Mr. Jones, you just kind of pointed it out, we need to reevaluate where we're at and where we want to go. But I'm walking away with a couple of different things that I think are really important points that you made. The one is biting off bite-sized pieces of this problem. Anytime you're faced with an enormous challenge that is not entirely within your control, you kind of first have to start with identifying what are the things that are in our control, and then go and attack those. We did the easy ones. We started with those things, but now there's some other things. And it also hits me that, this work started in this community not because a city council decided to start this work. That wasn't the origin of sustainability in the city of Dubuque. The origin was community members got together and said it was important to them, and they wanted to do something about it. And most of the sustainability work that we've done as a city, and a lot of us weren't even involved with the city council at the time that the sustainability work was done, most of that work has been community driven. I even think about the B branch. The B branch came from people saying, I don't want my house to flood anymore, do something about it. And then we came and dealt with it. And I think in some ways, it would be really helpful for us as a community to step back and think about the things that we can control in this situation and go back to attacking those now in this moment. Because there are quite a few still that we can do. And I think that there are things that not just the city can do, but there are also very energized community members that can get together and start to think about more ways to do these things. Incentivizing e-bikes, for example, or incentivizing EVs. It doesn't have to be a city function necessarily. It doesn't even need to be a government function. Somebody else can do it. It usually becomes a government function, but we might not be in that situation right now. I say all this because what I want to be able to walk away from this discussion with is the idea that there are things that we can do here to continue this really important work. And, we have a city council now that has decided that this work is important. We want to carry the torch from the councils before us to say, this is stuff we want to do. And I think that some of these things are going to be harder, definitely, based on the amount of funding we're going to get from partners in government. But some of these things might be actually achievable in ways that we can partner together with each other to be able to get it done. So that's what I would encourage us to think about as we do this. I think all of this, what I love about what you've given us is it's just, these are numbers. This is straight data. This is the stuff that we have something to go on here. So now we can take it and go do something with it. So hopefully what we can decide to do as a city council is figure out what our target needs to be and when we need to shoot for that target, because 5 years is a pretty close time frame. It wasn't in 2003, but it is now. So I think it's something that we need to definitely reevaluate. But as we reevaluate that and as we come up with goals and priorities that we have every single year, we've been really good at infusing sustainability into the goals and priorities that we have. And I think we need to continue to do that. And I think we need to continue to think about the things that are most important to people. And if you think about what's most important to people in this line of work, it's saving money on your bills and the things that you're going to pay for, making sure your house and your possessions are safe, and you and the people that you love are safe. So the resiliency from disasters, because we have to live within that reality. And in the basics, we like to breathe clean air and better air. So the ability to be able to do all those things, I think we can work on it together. So thank you for this discussion. Thanks for spurring this for us and for all this information. We appreciate you being here.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we've got 2 minutes until our next session, so we'll be adjourned until 6:30.